So I've just watched so-called Capernaum. I think it's pronounced like that anyway. And uh, as it happens, it was the first sort of um, movie that later on I discover happens to be highly rated by the average viewer. So much so it's in the top five role. Not that I mean, if I remembered it, I remember coming across it at some point while looking on the list, but I didn't remember it quite when I was actually watching. But yeah, so one could, I suppose, say that wasn't influenced by the fact that it's on such a list. I don't think it normally makes such a difference. I mean, I wasn't going to rate it much higher or lower, I think. But then again, one never knows, how one is influenced. And that's why I generally try to not to look at the rating before I view anything. But yeah, I don't know. It's one of those movies, one of those movies that are mainly just depressing. When it comes to that, I don't quite know. I mean, how you know, yeah, at least at the very least, it depicts reality. That's great. What movies are supposed to be about. Yes, as opposed to some um, a bizarre story. I mean, it is fiction ultimately, but it's very much based in reality. So it's not quite a documentary. The documentary would be entirely reality, but it's immersed in reality. It's still in a way fiction because it's still a film. It's not a documentary is the documentary has a different format because it is purely reality, as opposed to any sort of narrative at all, or you know. And in terms of what it's meant to show and such, and you know, it's it works. It surely works, sure. And people might accuse it of having too much pathos, but it's pathos based on reality. So as far as it goes, it doesn't feel unwarranted per se. It really it's there. It's when it comes to documentaries, it doesn't have this build up usually because it's more of a, like different facets. It's like having a cube and just looking from one side to another. Whereas a film is usually more gradual, more it's very interesting that the real life actor, was a Syrian refugee because of course he was supposedly practicing to assume the role of one in the film. So that's sort of a reversal of roles there, which is interesting, really. Um, uh, how everything happened. It's um, it's quite um, sad, I guess one could say that the war, which is still unfinished 9 years later, began when he was 7. That's one of the longest wars ever. It's longer than the Second World War. Now, I also noticed that there was a character called Assad. Assad in the movie. Of course, Assad is the dictator who just won't let go of Syria. Now the character in the movie was somewhat of a villain, but not even remotely as villainous, really, as Bashar. I mean, in the movie, he actually tried to help him a bit, even though somehow, for some reason, he just wanted to have the baby, and that's pretty much why he wanted to help him, apparently. But then again, there wasn't much alternative, I guess, in terms of. Um, so yeah, you know, the director somehow mentioned, I read the everything that was said in the about section of Sonic Classics page. It's quite long. There's quite a lot of detail there about how they recruited the actors and how the film was developed and how edited and such. Um, Yeah, and somehow I thought she thinks there's some sort of hope in all this. I mean, it really doesn't transmit hope at all. I mean, this specifically may not be a real life situation, but similar things exist, and the problem is that it's institutional, really, and institutions won't just dissolve themselves. So I really don't think that there is much hope. I mean, that there is despair in this film, but there really isn't much hope either, honestly. I mean, at least there is manufactured um some sort of salvation, one might say. I don't know. I'm still sort of reeling over the ridiculousness of that movie that I watched recently. Somehow also on top to 5 but hey, one good thing about this is that this is much more highly rated, it seems. I mean, of course, we're only dealing with decimals here, not exactly much difference, but it's like 100 places difference, though, nearly 100 places. So this is a much better. I mean, it's a real movie, really could say. It's yeah, it's as real as it can be, without being a documentary. That is. I mean, one thing I take from this film, really. I mean, one can only just conclude, really, that the whole world is just really messed up, and that's pretty much it. So which is why I'm saying, there is really no hope. Like, even in countries where this, I mean, it's not quite so messed up. I mean, obviously, most countries haven't just gone out of a war, which Lebanon was in once, and of course Syria still is in, and it does infer a sense of hopelessness in a way. I mean, this might be partially a reason why, it's not that I do not think highly of such films at all, but it's very difficult for me to rate them really highly because they make one feel so depressed. Of course, as opposed to, fictional fiction. um what made it even worse is that it was a vehicle for the ego of the director and actor and his whole family, who he also employed. You know, um, uh, you know, I mean that made the audience feel bad until, of course, a certain point where somehow he somehow conjures up a Jesus act. uh, yeah, what I termed obnoxious Jesus. Anyway, this isn't about that movie at all. In my opinion, that movie was absolutely idiotic, and I've no idea how it got any sort of reception at all. Um, this might be a slightly more obscure movie. Um, but it's a recent movie, so maybe people just didn't really get much of a chance in watching it. I mean, it was sort of publicized already. Got an Oscar nomination, not a win though. Loads of other accolades though. Loads. It was like a whole list. Um, but yeah, it's still. I mean, it's what's positive about this, of course, is the fact that it's so realistic. I mean, really, really realistic, and this is what makes it even more depressing, honestly. I mean, besides the fact that you know, he was playing a character called Zane, and he that is literally his name. So he just has a different surname. He said that the only difference is that the character was a criminal and he's not. Presumably, he also was never specifically put in the situation that he was put in the movie, where such a thing happened, in the last half hour, which is why he didn't turn out to be a criminal, because it's just one can understand, from this point of view. It just happens, and but this is the thing, though. As depressed as the film makes the audience feel, you know reading about its backgrounds, reading about biographies and everything, it's even more depressing. It's just so depressing that you know, like many of the things that happen in the movie also happened in real life somehow, as if people outside of the movie want to say, yep, this world is as corrupt, as screwed up as we depict it. This is truly reality. Um, it's just like that. I mean, it's just such a thing, where like to recruit the role of the Ethiopian. It was apparently very difficult because naturally, um, it could work against them, and that's exactly what happened. I mean, what kind of mindless brutality? Seriously, honestly, does this? Like, this was someone who is acting in a movie that was an absolute box office success. So somehow in China, for some reason, I don't quite understand why it was so popular in China. But yeah, and it was clearly it seems well received by both critics and audience. Not that, I mean, it's not like anyone knew that that was going to happen when it was being filmed. Of course, the point is, she was doing something. Um, I mean, I don't get it. I mean, the world is seriously as banal as, and even worse actually, than the movie depicted, right? So in the movie, in this title, at one point they say. That if he didn't have papers, he doesn't exist. And that is such a banal position, isn't it? Even the very fact that apparently the main reason why they cannot have them, well, I'm assuming besides the bureaucratic reasons, the very fact there isn't a pathway to it. But they also mentioned money. The very fact that it costs money, and costs money because of the bureaucracy behind it. I mean, that is the most banal thing ever. Like Douglas Adams, assigned, blamed Vogels for bureaucracy, right? For being the worst bureaucrats in the universe or such. But in reality, bureaucracy can actually be deadly, can it? I mean, the fact that they cannot visit a hospital because of some sort of paper is absolutely ludicrous. It's just a farce. It's risible if it wasn't, potentially deadly. Of course, I mean, this is besides the fact that in some of the countries, you cannot even visit hospitals due to it being an entirely insurance-based system, etc. It's the whole there's so many things that are just absurd in many countries. So in a way, this film really just shows people how the world is, even if, I mean, I don't know, maybe some people aren't very well sort of versed as to how the world is, but um, for others, sure, this will be, I suppose, a revelation. Um, and it's just it is depressing. That's pretty much it, right? It sort of reminded me of um, Grave of the Fireflies. Doesn't quite end as absolutely, awfully. I guess one could say it still ends awfully, and but not quite as much. Of course, it's not animated either, but it has a similar sort of setup, with regards to the children and such that take care of the and apparently the baby was in reality a girl, and that happens to be um the genders in Grave of the Fireflies as well. Has anything to do with it? I'm not entirely sure why the director seemed to think that just she couldn't have rewrote the script, because otherwise they might not have. um, thought of as relating. I don't know, why wouldn't they be able to relate? Presumably, the actor didn't know, but I don't know. Now, yeah, strange sort of bit of trivia, I guess one could say, is that the actor had at one point a Marvel Universe insignia. I know, I haven't actually watched them yet, but I suppose I recognize it, and um, I did read it in yeah, one of the connections on IMDb. Um, Now, what's interesting is that he went from this film directly to a future Marvel film, so it's quite something. Huh? I mean, this film was already successful by itself, so I guess success breeds success. He is really lucky then, I guess one could say. I mean, that they interviewed apparently many others as well, but they still had him in mind. They still wanted him. So that there are many others who wanted to be in that position and just aren't, and they could just as easily find out what happened, and then how successful the movie was, and they probably feel envious and such. But yeah, he wasn't lucky to be born in Syria 6 years before Civil War. No, 7 years. But then he was lucky in surviving it, escaping, and now he's going to Hollywood. That's quite a journey. So in a way, that is, I suppose, we could say, success. But this is the problem, then, of course. I mean, I was just reading, that even the UN was summoned to help all the real life actors. But what about the non-actors? I mean, that they weren't even supposed to be acting anyway. All the characters were similar to their own real lives, which is what made it cinema verite. Uh, uh, the, so the thing is that what about um, yeah, like at one point um, a camp called Kola was mentioned, and apparently it is a real camp. So what about everyone there, or the people in that awful overcrowded prison, which apparently houses half of all of Lebanon's prisoners, half, which is apparently was it 1,000 or something. Yeah, yeah, Lebanon might be slightly stable right now, but really, really could just fall apart at any time. My impression is I had watched I think another movie about it once some time ago, so I don't quite watch that many uh, from Lebanon. I only pretty much remember one, but yeah, once watched. I think it was in Sandi's. Was it based on Lebanon, or maybe I'm confusing it. Um, it's slightly different though. It's more of a detective sort of story as opposed to a realistic movie sort of thing. Uh, I think it was fictional, although I can't quite remember. Um, so I this doesn't say. Just a journey to the Middle East. That's all it says. It's annoying when they do that. Why can they be more specific? And yeah, that this is also another top 5 movie, and it's also very painful as well to watch. It's more there's more violence in it generally. Um, so as you know, so yeah, I mean, um, Capernaum was depressing, but not very very violent. So it had pathos without violence as such. And Sundays was more about the pathos through violence per se. I mean, this whole dysfunctional structure of many countries uh, is rooted in, I mean, in a way, one could say the very idea, the very concept of a government is really rooted in violence. And yeah, Sundays was based on the Lebanese Civil War. That's when I read about it, and of course technically it was some time ago. I mean, still, ended in 30 years ago, which isn't so bad, and lasted a very long time. Yeah, it's even longer. It's wow, 15 years. So if the war in Syria follows the same trajectory, then it will end in 2014, technically. Wait, is it? No, 16. I mean, yeah, 16. Anyway, yeah. So yeah, Incendies is also the one I watched before. Well, I watched it before I ever started to commentate like this, so don't have quite my thoughts from back then. I did read a lot about how the Civil War erupted and everything. So at least I have some sort of it was very very brutal, wasn't it? Just very brutal. Um, in a way, thought different to how Syria is panning out currently. So the Lebanese Civil War is more religious in nature. Syria is more about um, dictatorial government that just won't let go, as opposed to, I mean, there were, I think, bloodless resignations and such in other countries, I think. But there was supposed to be one in Egypt, but didn't quite succeed with Sisi now, who is practically the same sort of person. I think Tunisia had a better outcome than most, I think. For suppose because of that I didn't quite follow it up very much now. Yeah, of course, Saudi Arabia practically had nothing. I mean, I think there were a few protests, but they were quite quite stopped. Although presumably, I don't know if there were reforms, these supposed reforms made recently. They might have been due to that, to try to sort of stem public opinion turning against. Of course, it's a slightly different situation. I mean, well, practically not really, I suppose. I mean, the other countries had dictators, whereas Saudi Arabia has absolute monarchs. So practically the same thing, but just different titles, I suppose. Um, so then again, this is sort of the difference between having no elections to having elections and yet being obviously corrupted like Russia has and such. Uh, so yeah, you know, uh, Capernaum wasn't essentially about politics. Instead, these was more just slightly. I mean, it was more about a familiar investigation, but obviously, yeah, the heart of it was the Civil War. So more about politics than. Yeah. But the point is that there is a background structure to all of this, and it's just so corrupted, so dysfunctional. And sure enough, children have nothing to do with it. are simply overwhelmed. Apparently, the actor that played his sister in the movie, uh, I mean, she's still alive, but yeah, her sister isn't. So this is truly a as close as film can get to reality, to brutal reality. To reality that doesn't even create fiction out of fact. It's almost it's hazy. It can be one or the other, and one doesn't quite know which one it might be. You know, apparently all the situations she devised, the director came up with, and you know, script write it, were real life situations. They might not have happened specifically to the actors, although a lot of things did happen. But apparently, they might have happened to others, and they just integrated them. From my understanding, so it's a really documentary sort of film, really. Mm. I mean, I've commented on another one where they tried something somewhat different and yet sort of similar but different. American Animals in the past I commented on. Um, yeah, different though, because yeah, they do integrate the literal documentary sort of techniques in the movie, but otherwise use fictional actors and they integrate both. It's hard to tell which one is more realistic in this sense, because Capernaum does have a a almost fictional narrative. It's still based very much in reality, but still fictional. So not specifically, I mean, in terms of the knife attack, etc. That is fictional, unless it's happened to someone else and they just integrated them. Probably happened, but specifically though to this person, Zane, etc. It didn't happen, as opposed to in American Animals where it did happen to, but it's still played by fictional characters. Still, those actors in this sense were more fictional than Zane was in this film. But it's sort of like a puzzle, where some that is fictional isn't fictional and such, so it's not quite, it's still different, but they still both try to do something similar from different directions, though, I think, so this is more subtle, so whereas the other one was more unsubtle, and well, it was in a way, though they are similar because they're both about a crime, just slightly different, the other crime wasn't quite, it cannot by any means be related to, because it was just a crime of greed, really. This was contextually, just this is just reality. It can be reality, isn't quite specifically reality, but can very much be, likely was. And so this is why it was interesting. It's still very, very depressing though. It's not a film one can say one has escaped to. It's not escape. It's absolute. It's really, really not. And the fact that these things can happen. And by the way, these things happen with people who say that, encouraged by people who say, "Ooh, what a surprise! What a they're into families, those kind of people would say, "Oh yeah, we support families," except when we don't. Oh, let's leave hypocrisy out of this anyway. This is slightly, well, it is slightly different. I mean, Lebanon has a civil war, so in a way, dysfunctionality is there at its fundament. That is what it's about. Now, I got to admit, I don't know much more about Lebanon than the little I've read about civil wars. I'm not quite an expert or anything, and yeah, I don't quite know much about culture, but it's so yeah. As a film, though, it's interesting. how it was constructed and everything. And the pathos does work, in my opinion, truly.